Good morning and welcome to today's lecture, part 2 of this now 2-part series on board games. This time I'm going to talk about negotiation. And like anything having to do with human interaction, it is an intuitively understood concept with unclear, confusing and often fuzzy boundaries. Like politics. While most people would feel confident in recognizing a negotiation-heavy game, they would often disagree to what extent negotiation actually happens, or even how much of it is necessitated by the game and how much it's the people who bring the desire to negotiate to the table. Let's say, for the sake of a facetiously made argument, that you were to ask a random group of gamers about the most essential negotiation games. You would most likely get a long list of games like Chinatown, Lords of Vegas, Bonanza, Sheriff of Nottingham, Diplomacy, Thief, Settlers of Catan, I'm the Boss, Intrigue, and a great many others. Instead of diving into each individual mention, I'm more interested in looking for similarities to get a better idea as to what gamers typically recognize as negotiation. The most obvious trait, of course, is the fact that negotiation involves talking to one another. In a great many cases, this talking quickly becomes haggling. So let's quickly outline haggling and what it means to our understanding negotiation. Haggling is concerned with the value of the object being haggled over. How many coins is this vase worth? How much coal do I get when I buy this mine? How many victory points do I get for this tile? If these values are fixed and unchangeable, haggling isn't an option. As long as their value can change or be reset later on, there is room for flexibility and thus negotiation. Chinatown's method of scoring buildings is a good example of individual pieces changing in victory point value as the game progresses. This notion of flexibility, malleability even, is an essential one, and I will return to it later on. As an aside, negotiation is of course not entirely limited to verbal interaction. A lot of team-based card games allow for teammates to negotiate a strategy based on non-verbal clues like which actions they've taken. Players align or adjust their own strategy based on inferred information from non-verbal means. Games like Hanabi, Creo, and arguably Bridge are examples of this. Now, moving on. The second feature of negotiation games seems to be closely tied to some kind of exchange, be it trading resources, cards, currency, as you would in games like Bonanza, Sheriff of Nottingham, or Settlers of Catan. But with a little bit of ingenuity and willingness to move beyond the confines of the rules, one could easily expand this to also include promises of future actions. Thinking of it this way even allows us to include trade as a subcategory of negotiation. Let's think of negotiation as being about exchanging assurances of future actions once certain conditions are met. We can look at trade as a case of immediately fulfilled conditions to trigger the enactment of a given promise. You agree to give me 1 stone if I'm willing to give you 1 sheep in return, and we then move on to do just that. We now have seen trade as a realization of a negotiated agreement. Like the exact opposite of Brexit. Separating those 2 steps of negotiation and exchange is useful as it highlights another part of negotiation that can easily be overlooked. The success of negotiation does not depend on whether you get what you want, nor does it hinge on denying another player exactly what they want. In fact, negotiation is always about creating a robust agreement between everybody involved, since it provides the basis of future dealings and negotiations within the game, or possibly later games as well. If another player agrees to an outcome that is in fact bad for them, you've successfully deceived that player, but you didn't successfully negotiate. While this can and does happen with some regularity in negotiation-heavy games, we should be mindful not to conflate the two. Negotiation is a productive method, that is to say, a method that does not undermine itself when used successfully. Once you've deceived another player, the likelihood of negotiating in the future diminishes rapidly. So how to best sum up these disparate elements into one coherent idea of negotiation? I propose using the following. Negotiation is the attempt to realign your current position in order to establish a new status quo acceptable to all players until another round of negotiation is entered. In that sense, negotiation goes beyond haggling and includes assets that are not directly tied to any in-game resource. Naturally, in order to realign your position as you negotiate, your position needs to be flexible. Negotiation is not possible if one or both parties have nowhere to go or are unwilling to do so. That is why negotiation is not actually about power, but about compromise. Any attempt to exert power, be it openly or hidden, to achieve your goal is merely an example of removing a player's agency. It is the opposite of negotiation. Last time I ended the lecture with a somewhat controversial statement that diplomacy is an awful, awful game. That was of course hyperbole in order to entice you to join me in this lecture. Diplomacy is not an awful, awful game. It is in fact barely a game. Diplomacy is a social experiment using a historical framework. Its closest comparison would probably be the Milgram experiment, which, in layman's terms, asked, would you be willing to act like an unrepentant shitheel if told to by a figure of authority? Diplomacy merely replaces that authority with a winning condition and asks, just how much of an unrepentant shitheel are you willing to become in order to win a bloody competition? Its status as the granddaddy of negotiation games is actually a misnomer, as it merely satisfies the most superficial demands of negotiation, namely that it's all talk. That is it. There's no actual flexibility in your position, as there's only one objective and you cannot waver in pursuing it. At most you can try to keep yourself in the game long enough to fulfill it before anybody else does. Because diplomacy is not about negotiation, but about exploring ways to put psychological pressure on other players. During the course of play, acceptance of and submission to a stark social hierarchy is normalized. That is to say, diplomacy teaches its players that the strong must dominate and eliminate the weak. Moreover, in order to stay in the game, you need to make sure that you are not marked as weak. So you need to make sure you find somebody below you to kick, preferably out of the game. Diplomacy may be the only game, with the possible exception of Monopoly, to make victory seem so filthy, nauseating, and pathetic. The so-called game portion of diplomacy exists solely in its end condition. One player has wrestled control of more than half of the board. The rest of the rules, governing notation, movement, and conflict resolution, do not in any meaningful way expand gameplay, so much as articulate its engagement. It's as elegant a design as the DOS prompt is an elegant user interface. The alternative end state of the game, the stalemate, is barely worth mentioning, as it is merely an agreement to abort the activity as opposed to an actual resolution to any of the player's goals. An option which, at least in theory, is available to all before even starting the first turn. Or put differently, a strange game. The only winning move is not to play. How about a nice game of chess? Let me instead talk about a game that encapsulates negotiation in board games better than any other game I'm currently aware of. It not only gives players meaningful decisions to make, but also lets them position and reposition themselves as they engage each other, providing the necessary flexibility to allow for actual negotiation. That game is Pandemic. So how exactly does Pandemic allow for negotiation in a way that diplomacy does not? First, it allows each player to have their own assessment of the game state, all of which are valid. Even though the group shares an overarching goal, there are multiple short-term achievements that need to be reached first. Cures need to be researched, infected cities need to be treated, and maybe you need to build new research centers to improve your ability to quickly reach faraway cities that may end up infected. Since you can't know exactly when an epidemic card may be drawn, or calculate which cards will end up in your hands at the end of the turn, and you can't fully predict which cities will be infected, Pandemic creates an uncertainty as to what the game state will develop into. We won't know exactly what the board will look like 2 turns from now, so a group may arrive at multiple equally valid assessments of the situation on the board. One player may argue to end your turn near a research station. to research a cure next turn. Another may propose removing cubes of a certain color to increase the chances of eradicating a virus. Yet another may be more concerned with stopping the possibility of an outbreak. Even though everybody at the table pursues the same objective, it is only when cards are actually drawn that the so-called correct analysis materializes. Until that point, multiple assessments may be equally valid. A simple fact that alpha players are incapable or unwilling to accept, thus leading them to harming play. It is through negotiation that players can adjust their assessment and arrive at a joint course of action. That is why Pandemic shines with skilled negotiators. Regardless of whether the group wins or loses, the process of negotiation makes the experience stand out. Bad or ineffective negotiators simply give way to alpha player syndrome of one dominant player attempting to drag the group to so-called success. Without negotiation, Pandemic becomes a chore, if not outright unpleasant to play. When Pandemic works, it promotes understanding and empathy among its players, rewarding groups that are strongly inclusive and that strive to find common ground with each other. Negotiation, when implemented and pursued well, is a powerful tool to make board games not only come to life, but to make them become more than a playful challenge meant to divert and amuse. They become a way in which we can connect with one another. That seems as good an ending to this lecture as any other, so I will leave you with the topic of my next lecture. Meaning. Full decisions. Thank you, and that is all.